Chapter 26, Hog Slaughter, November and December 1856. In his whole life, and he'd be 13 just after the first of the year, he'd never had such bad food as what he cooked for himself and Pa. His flapjacks were leather patches, and his chicken dribbled a thin stream of pinkish juices, and the lumps in his cornmeal mush were as hard as hailstones. Pa tried not to complain, but James noticed that Pa was pulling his belt a notch tighter. And then Jeremy came around with the news that it was time to slaughter a few hogs for the winter table. "We're doing our own, too, and one for you and one for Olnius, since your friends are too lily-livered to do it yourselves. Come on." There wasn't anybody to tell he was leaving, so James just took off down the road, and Jeremy babbled about the hog slaughtering. "Once they're dead as a tree stump, we'll boil 'em to loosen the bristles so we can scrape the hide clean. Doesn't tickle that way." "I'm not one bit sure I'm going to like this," James said, hurrying along beside Jeremy, and yet he was excited at the prospect of doing something so masculinely Kansas. "Oh, you're going to have a picnic. I remember back to my first hog butchering, my Pa and I never did have such a good time as that ever again." They jumped a fence and cut through Barkin's lawn. "So then after the hide's clean, we hang the carcass from a big thick limb, peel off the hide, gut the thing. There's hardly no waste to a hog. The liver's good, the lungs, the kidneys, the brains. Pigs have got big brains. I wouldn't have guessed. You like pork sausage?" "Sure." "Well, Jeremy ruined sausage for him. It's stuffed into the gut of the hog, you know. We yank out the intestines and scrape them, wash them good, and fill them up with all manner of good, savory, chopped up pig meat and spices." What with the food he'd been cooking and dead hog talk, James was pretty sure he'd never eat again. "First thing we save those good spare ribs and backbone. Best eating on the hog, and later on we'll salt down the shoulders and hams and cure 'em, and we'll hang 'em in the smokehouse forever and a day, and by Christmas you'll have the tastiest ham you ever put your mouth to." Well, he sure did love ham, all salty sweet, lying on a plate next to some hot spiced apples. Maybe this butchering business wouldn't be so bad after all, if it resulted in a fat, pink, juicy Christmas ham. They jumped the last fence into Macken's place. "Here goes," James said, as if he were diving off a cliff. James hunkered up to sit on the fence for a good view of the whole thing, but Jeremy wouldn't hear of it. "Maybe you ain't gonna kill him, but you can sure as the devil help us round him up." With Mr. Macken's help, they chased the 4 fat porkers out of the barn into a small pen. The hogs looked like they knew what was coming, just like a turkey knows it'll be the guest of honor at dinner soon. So those hogs squealed and caterwauled. James tried to grab one, but it slithered right out of his hands. He was surprised to feel how bristly the hide was, not soft and smooth like a horse. "Grab one and hang on to him," Mr. Macken yelled, and finally, after a dozen slip-throughs, James straddled the hog and grabbed its 2 front legs, the only white parts on the whole black critter. Then, before the hog knew what hit it, Jeremy came down on its head with the handle of an axe. James felt the hog sink out from under his legs. "Hold his head up," Jeremy commanded, as the butcher knife caught the sun and blinded James, while Mr. Macken slit the hog's throat. Blood muddied the ground. James backed away, his stomach heaving. "Grab another one, James." But James just kept taking it another step back and another, as James said to his pa, "What did I do?" "Aw, nothing, son. There's just different ways of being. Bet he'll smack his lips over the spare ribs, though." "Come on, son. We've got plenty work to do before we lose the sunlight. One man short," Jeremy muttered. As James slid his leg back over the fence, he suddenly remembered the Hindu man he'd met back in Boston, the only person he ever knew who wasn't a Christian. His skin was nearly as dark as the Negroes out here. Now, why did he think of that man, all of a sudden, when he'd not given the Hindu a moment's thought in a year's time? And then it hit him. The Hindu was a vegetarian. After everybody had slaughtered their hogs and here and there a calf, it seemed the typhoid fever spread like grass fire. "Unsanitary conditions," Dr. Olney said. "Unsanitary meat, unsanitary cooking, unsanitary human hygiene." Sure, it's going to spread like wildfire, spread like a vicious rumor. This isn't the time to talk about such things, said Mrs. Olney, who was trying to hurry them through first day dinner before her baby was wailing with hunger and clutching at Mrs. Olney's chest right there at the dinner table. But James was in no hurry to finish this dinner. Real home-cooked food. Bread warm from the oven, crusty and brown, but soft as cake inside. Sweet potato and pumpkin pie, the color of his own hair, and chicken that wasn't raw. A veritable feast. He ate like he was Moses, starving in the desert for 40 days. When he couldn't swallow another bite, and even Pa had to loosen his belt, and the baby could be heard slurping at Mrs. Olney's over in the corner. James went outside to help Solomon groom the horses. Solomon's arm had healed, but he looked as worn as a rag because he'd been driving Dr. Olney from house to farm morning until midnight. There's sick people all over this town, he said. They leaned against a bale of prickly hay. The wind whistled through the slats of the barn. Already the water in the trough was starting to freeze up, and the horses needed warm blankets at night and a good rub down in the morning to get going. Solomon slyly asked, "Heard from your ma?" "Not yet. It's only been 2 weeks." "Nothing from that other woman either?" Solomon fiddled with the buckle on his belt boots. "Which one's that?" "Thee means Miss McCann." "Other one. Dr. Robinson's wife? Miss Bowers?" "Lots of women around there." Solomon hung his hat between his knees, just waiting him out. "Oh, does this mean Miss Lisbeth Charles? That her name? The one who washed thee down like thee was a horse and put that stinky poultice on thy arm?" "You're mighty fresh, James Weaver." "Her? No, I haven't heard from her," he said, stealing a sideways glance at Solomon. "Oh, except she gave me a message for thee, something about getting married." Solomon tossed his hat in the air and landed on a horse's head. "Miss Lisbeth's fixing to get married?" "Did I say that?" James turned to the horse that was trying to buck off the hat. "Did I tell the man she was getting married?" The horse whinnied. "I believe the message was more like, you tell that Solomon not to run off and marry anybody." Solomon's weary face lit up. "Thee watch out for her when she comes back in the spring. I think she likes thee, Solomon." Maybe because he was still so weak from his journey, or maybe because he'd been in so many sick houses, Solomon came down with a typhoid fever. James and Pa ran into Dr. Olney at Round Corner Drug Store, and the doctor said, "Caleb, I can't risk his giving it to my little one if she's going to make it through her first winter out here." In a few short months, James was already taller than Dr. Olney, who was looking thin, his cheeks all sunken, his face grayish. Pa said, "Thee must bring Solomon to our house." "What? Who would take care of him?" "It's just James and me, and we're of hearty stock," Dr. Olney nodded. There was no time for flowery thank yous. Pa had to go over to Lecompton to pick up some legal papers, but he swore he'd be home before dark to help look after Solomon. Solomon came to the house, leaning heavily on little Dr. Olney. "Where to?" the doctor asked. "There's a small room upstairs," James said, "Miss Lisbeth's room. He needs a warm place. Fix him a pallet in front of the fire." James ran upstairs and dragged the straw mattress and a couple of bed sheets down. Solomon slumped in the rocker while Dr. Olney rolled his sleeves up. "Where's your pa? He'll be back by nightfall, promise." They quickly made up a bed for Solomon on the floor. His knees buckled and he nearly collapsed on the bed. James drew the top sheet up to Solomon's chin. "More blankets," Dr. Olney said. "He'll have the shakes in a minute, and just when these got him warmed up, he'll kick off all the covers with the sweats. Thee will have thy hands full, son." So in barely the time for the crack of the whip, James became not only a bad cook, but also a bad nurse. Dr. Olney told him everything he needed to know while Solomon snored loudly. "The poor man will have pains in his head, his back, his arms and legs. Nothing to do for it. He may vomit." "I couldn't handle that, Dr. Olney." The doctor glared at him while he rolled his sleeves down again. "Thee can handle whatever thee has to, friend." "Yes, sir. Advantage stages. He'll have ulcerations in his intestines." Ulcerations, sir?" "Open sores inside. Very painful. Just try to keep him comfortable. Snug as a bug in a rug," James said. "My words exactly. And wash him with cool water for the fever. Give him lots to drink, clear liquids, no milk. And thee must be sure to wash thine own hands real carefully after thee takes care of Solomon, and pray he's strong enough to make it through, in spite of thy care. James shot nervous glances towards Solomon, who seemed to be drifting in and out of sleep. I sure wish my mom was back from Boston. Well, I wish I was there, son. People don't die of typhoid fever in Boston. Doctor only slipped on his coat, and soon it was just James and a sick to dying man alone in this house, with the first snow of the winter bunching up on the windows. It was going to be a long winter. Dark, and there was no sign of Pa. Solomon moaned, sort of sucked his lips like a fish. Thee must be thirsty. James put a dipper of water to Solomon's lips, but the man hadn't the strength to sit up. He remembered how Miss Lisbeth and Ma had spooned water into Rebecca's mouth, and so he tried doing the same thing. Most of the water slid down Solomon's chins. He tilted his head back to let the water cool his feverish neck. James needed to wash him down, but he'd never done such a thing and couldn't imagine touching another person so intimately. But he went for a pan of water and hoped he could just hand the damp rag to Solomon to do the business himself. What if Solomon had to relieve himself? He thought about Henry Brown, the man who mailed himself into a packing crate. Rebecca's asking what he did when he had to make water while he was going through the mail. If only Miss Lisbeth had told him that night. Suddenly the door burst open, as if the wind had forced the catch, and there was a vicious blast of cold air. Solomon's eyes grew terrified at the sudden shift in temperature. James got up to close the door and saw her standing there. Miss Lisbeth, his first thought was, she's here to help Solomon. But one look at her, and he realized he'd have two patients on his hand. And it struck him that Pa would be back before the night was out, and he'd catch Miss Lisbeth, and when Ma got back, James would be to blame for it all. Miss Lisbeth fell onto the mattress in front of the fire, as if there weren't already an occupant there. She simply shoved Solomon over. She was wheezing, trying to catch her breath so she could speak. You can't stay. Pa's due back any minute. He heard the terrible rattling in her chest. She motioned for something to drink, and he fetched her a cup of water, hot off the stove. She looked awful, with dark rings under her eyes. Her buffalo cape slid down to reveal spindles of hair and welts on her neck. Oh, Lord. Solomon woke up, surprised to find he wasn't alone. Miss Lisbeth? Finally, she caught her voice and said, What's he doing here? Typhoid fever, James said. She felt his face, which was the color of burnished copper, burning up. Can thee do anything? James asked helplessly. Of course, soon as I can breathe. But thee can't stay. Don't be foolish. It's down way below freezing out there. Your daddy can't get through in this weather, and I sure can't go back out in it. I told you I'd only come back if I had nowhere else to go. She was starting to warm up, so she slipped the cape off. I need help pulling off my boots, because my fingers are frozen and they might just snap off if I pull too hard. So James yanked at her boots, and with them came the rags her feet had been wrapped in. Her bare feet embarrassed him. So pink on the bottom, but the toenails were pitch black from the boots. Or was it gangrene? She sipped at the hot water and also dabbed at Solomon's neck with the wash rag. I've had days I liked better than this one, she said. Solomon Jefferson, you're going to have to sit up so's I can take your shirt off, or you're going to be delirious with fever in a minute. And then she seemed to take over as usual, ordering James around to fetch this and that. More blankets. I'll make me a bed here beside Solomon. We won't neither one of us sleep much tonight anyway. James was sure that he'd never in his life been so glad to see anyone as he was to see Miss Lisbeth, no matter what kind of a fit Pa would have when he came home. If Pa made it through what was becoming not just the first snowfall, but the first blizzard of the winter.